The first thing you need to do when creating a landscape is to mix the colors in the photo or plein air view you are going to paint. I did some research regarding how to make the right color turquoise for the water since this is a tropical scene. While I did that, I discovered I needed to use white and phthalo blue to create the turquoise. I also researched how to create the white sand beach color, which was mostly white and yellow ochre with a little burnt sienna added. Notice how I always start with the lighter colors when mixing paint so I don't make more of the color than I need to reduce the cost of materials. Another thing I learned during my research was that as objects move away from us in the distance, they get lighter and slightly cooler or bluer, which makes sense if you realize how light particles scatter as they come through the atmosphere, creating the blue we see in the sky. That color would then be reflected on any other object as you look in the distance. Once you have your colors mixed, you can block the composition onto your canvas. Knowing that there was a lot of blue in my composition, I painted the entire canvas a light blue so there was some background color on the canvas before I blocked in the land and clouds with a white chalk pastel. Many painters use vine charcoal to block in their images on canvas. Part of the reason I used white chalk pastel to block in these outlines is that white pastel will wipe off the canvas if your painted marks were a little off of the outlines, and the white pastel shouldn't affect the color of the paint the way the vine charcoal can. The first thing I began to paint was the darker part of the sky. I thinned the acrylic I was using with water, so I made a nice value transition from lighter to darker. It took a while to get the transition smooth with a large brush. While I normally suggest working on all of the background first, I needed to let the sky dry before I could paint the clouds seen in the reference photo. Rather than waiting, I moved on to an area of the canvas that was dry to start the dark blue transitions of the water. You should notice I painted right through some of the lines that I originally drew rather than stopping before I touched the shapes. This allows the color painted to go completely behind the image or subject that is in the front of the painting. Knowing I could just redraw any object I painted through, I didn't worry about painting through those objects. Once the water was done, I moved on to the islands in the background because the sky was still too wet to paint the clouds. While the islands in the front of the composition are a dark hunter green, the islands in the back are a light olive green. To achieve this color, I used the hunter green I made using Hooker's green and burnt umber. To make that color into a light olive green, I started with white and added the hunter green I mixed for the islands in front. I also added blue to make the island recede from what I learned about aerial perspective earlier. When I was painting this island, I noticed I dripped water onto the blue of the water and it began to run. I then picked up the larger brush to smooth that out so there wasn't a permanent scar on my canvas. Additionally, I used a larger brush for the sky and water since they are such large areas. While painting the water, I sometimes used the brush in a horizontal motion on the canvas, using the entire flat side of the brush to smooth things, and other times I twisted the brush perpendicular to use the thinner side of the brush in order to imitate the waves I could see in my reference image. As I painted the islands coming closer to the viewer, I added more of the hunter green to my palette to make those islands darker to replicate the colors that I could see in my resource photo. As I came to the front islands, I used hunter green alone, but added a little water and pushed the brush onto the canvas in a scumbled value technique in order to mimic the leaves of the trees and bushes on the island. Once this was finished, I stepped back and reevaluated the color of the island in the distance and noticed it was too much of a yellow-green. So I added more hunter green and blue to my original color in order to achieve the right olive green color to that back island. Once the islands were done, I noticed the paint in the sky was finally dry, so I went back and used white with smoky blue to reproduce the puffy rain clouds I could see in the reference image. I used a similar scumbling technique with the white and blue to create the clouds, sometimes dabbing the color with my finger or a paper towel to smooth the color or remove paint to create the right texture for those clouds. Notice that I started with the white first and added the smoky blue mixed with a little green on the bottom of the clouds where they were heavier with rain. Additionally, I added more white to create more contrast in the clouds on the right-hand side. When I was happy with the way the clouds looked, I started adding the sand color to the bottom of the closer islands to imitate how one can see the sand on the shore and beneath some of the water. I painted a harsher line next to the greenery of the island and faded the sand color into the blue using a bit more water. I also added washes of sand color into the blue of the water because the water in tropical areas is very clear and one can normally see sand and vegetation in the water. I added a darker turquoise on the right side, but then decided to eliminate that color as the sand color looked better. After the sand was dry, I used the hunter green to add more convincing looking vegetation toward the bottom of the islands in the foreground. I then began to add the lighter turquoise to the middle ground between the islands to mimic the waves one can see in the reference image. I also added another wash of darker blue to the foreground to add more contrast. When that was dry, I blocked in the vegetation that was closest to the viewer in the image with chalk pastel. I used burnt umber with a much smaller brush to create the trunks of the trees and then used another scumbling motion to create the leaves of the bushes and trees in the foreground. As I painted these leaves, I also used burnt umber and the lighter olive green as there were more details visible in the front objects of any artwork. I used the lighter green for the leaves of the tree on the right and then started adding dioxazine purple to the brush in order to push it farther behind the two trees in front. I also added hunter green and dioxazine purple to the trees to give the leaves more depth and detail. The leaves on the tree on the left were more flat, so I randomly made diagonal paint strokes to reproduce that shape on my canvas. Lastly, I added a little of the sand color to the trunks of the trees and a little in the leaves to highlight certain details. Hopefully you can see how creating specific colors and using different blending techniques in a landscape can help show the perspective and proportions of objects one is looking at when trying to paint. While it's not a perfect photo representational painting, one gets the impression of the tropical image.